Welcome to the History Unplugged podcast, the unscripted show that celebrates unsung heroes, myth-busts historical lies, and rediscovers the forgotten stories that changed our world. I'm your host, Scott Rank. Hey everyone, welcome back to the next installment in our series Rendezvous with Death, where we're looking at Americans who joined the Foreign Legion years before America entered World War I. In the previous episode, our Americans went on a train to Toulouse and were finally joining the war effort and were getting into the battles. Now we're going to see what happens as the war picks up. The Foreign Legion fighting in France was divided into two separate regiments. The 1st Régiment Étranger, or 1st Regiment, and the 2nd Regiment. The Americans serving along the Chemin des Dames in the winter of 1914 to 1915 were incorporated into the latter. Not all American volunteers of 1914, however, were with the 2nd Étranger. For a number of reasons, smaller numbers of American volunteers had been mustered into the 1st Étranger. Two marching regiments had Americans in them. The 2nd Company of the 1st Étranger included among its ranks Kenneth Weeks of Boston, Paul Pavelka of Madison, Connecticut, Russell Kelly and Jack Cordonier of New York, Frank Musgrave of San Antonio, Lawrence Scanlon of Cedarhurst, Long Island, and Jack Jantz of Philadelphia. Weeks was one of the more interesting volunteers of 1914. He was an aspiring architect who had studied at MIT and in Paris and had turned to writing in the years immediately before the war and published a number of books. Like Alan Seeger, he'd fully embraced Paris and France as a whole. Kenneth Weeks was old money. He could trace his lineage back to ancestors aboard the Mayflower in 1620. He was also generous, sharing the comforts of his considerable fortune made possible with his comrades. Like so many of the volunteers of 1914, he saw the war in highly idealistic terms. Writing to his mother after enlisting in August, he explained to her that, "In defending France, I hope to defend you." Paul Pavelka, on the other hand, seems to have been drawn simply by the possibility of a great adventure. He was nicknamed Sailor or Skipper by his comrades, and Pavelka had left home at age 14, and he'd been, as he calls it, cook in a sheep camp in the West, a cowboy, an assistant nurse in a San Francisco hospital. Then he'd taken to sea and sailed all across the ocean. With a small band of comrades, he had once walked across South America. He had been in Australia and the South Sea Islands and was living at a sailor's home in New York when the war started. After working his way across the Atlantic on a horse transport, he enlisted in the Legion at the port of La Rochelle in November 1914. With his enlistment papers signed, he was given 5 francs and railway ticket to the main Legion depot in Lyon. Russell Kelly, formerly a cadet at the Virginia Military Institute, and electrical engineering student Lawrence Scanlon met Pavelka in Lyon, where the three received the training before being sent to the trenches. Kelly's letters home to his father revealed a young man taken with France and the camaraderie of life in the Legion. He was particularly impressed with the bread in France, which he described as excellent, asserting that no bread in the States can equal it. Tulane University graduate Frank Musgrave was practicing law in Texas. Jack Jantz, like Pavelka, was a seaman. Both also found their way across the Atlantic and into the Legion in 1914 and would serve with the 2nd Company of the 1st Regiment. In March of 1915, having reached the limit of what he would take from abusive Sergeant Edward Morley, Giffen Rockwell requested a transfer from the 2nd Regiment Étranger to the 1st Étranger. With his request approved, Rockwell joined Weeks, Pavelka, and other Americans of the 2nd Company of the 1st Étranger in April 1915. He found his new mates much to his liking and was pleasantly surprised to find a fellow VMI man, Kelly, among their number. Initially put into the lines near Verzenay, they experienced the filth, the rats, boredom, and when they had downtime, baseball. Paul Pavelka, demonstrating his resourceful nature, made a baseball out of the business end of a cartridge, he called it, around which he wound, worsted, and thread alternately, and covered with leather he stitched together from a leather putée. In a war zone, the Americans entertained the rest of their comrades in the 2nd Company by playing the game they had played as boys on the other side of the Atlantic. The crowd looked on curiously until Long Islander Lawrence Scanlon hit a mighty home run into a nearby canal, putting an end to Pavelka's ball and the game. Within weeks, the Americans were headed for the Arras sector in Artois. Something big was afoot. France was preparing to drive the German invaders from its soil. The effort would be unprecedented in size and scope. Russell Kelly sensed something was imminent as they departed Verzenay, but the New Yorker admitted that what exactly it was a puzzle to all. The second company of the 1st Étranger was one of a number of distinct units that collectively formed a division. Along with the heterogeneous legionnaires, there were units of Algerian and Tunisian light infantry that were recruited from France's colonial possessions. There were Senegalese, there were those from Senegal, and of course Moroccans in its ranks. It was as part of this unit that American volunteers found themselves relocated to a staging area in the village of Betonsart in Artois. The country north of the city of Arras was primarily farmland, with an imposing ridge commanding the view in all directions. This land would see some of the most intense fighting of the entire war, and it would bear the scars. German veteran and author Ernst Hunger described what he saw there. Ripped haversacks, broken rifles, scraps of cloth, counterpointed grotesquely with children's toys, shell fuses, deep craters from explosions, bottles, harvest implements, shredded books, battered household gear, holes whose gaping darkness betrayed the presence of basements where the bodies of the unlucky inhabitants of the houses were gnawed by the particularly assiduous swarm of rats. A little espaliered peach tree despoiled of its sustaining wall and spreading its arms pitifully. In the cattle byres and stables and barns, the bones of livestock still dangling from their chains. Trenches dug through the ravaged gardens and among sprouting bulbs of onion, wormwood, rhubarb, narcissus, buried under weeds. On the neighboring fields, grain barns through whose roofs the grain was already sprouting, all that with half-buried communication trenches through it, and all suffused with the smell of burning and decay. The division that the Americans were part of, the Division Marocain, was given the task of leading the attack on the German positions in this haunted and depopulated landscape. There had already been serious fighting in the sector in the fall of 1914, where the Germans seized the ridge and the Allies tried, unsuccessfully, to drive them off in the First Battle of Artois. The hamlet of La Targette was their first objective, then on to seize the Vimy River 3 kilometers away. The French High Command had confidence in the division's ability to carry this off. It was already becoming renowned for its uncanny dash and ferociousness when attacking. When defending, well, that was another matter, but that's not what they were ordered to do. The Division Marconnais' offensive ethos was captured in its motto, "No fear, no pity." Rockwell and his new comrades were swept up in the anticipation of the attack they all knew was coming soon. From Betonsart, they moved into reserve trenches just behind the fort line at a place called Berthenval Farm. Here, they made acquaintance with the sticky red mud of Artois, they said. For 6 days they waited, not without their own individual fear certainly, but collectively restless, eager, like thoroughbreds to be allowed to run. Shortly before the attack, the Legionnaires decided to shave off their winter beards. Kevin Rockwell had acquired the nickname, through both regiments, of the Legion, as the tall fellow with the beard, due to his impressive facial hair. Now they would all face battle clean-shaven. The unit's French officers also recognized the moment for what it was, and put on their best uniforms with all their medals and wore fresh white gloves as if going to a dress parade. They'd make conspicuous targets for German gunners. After an initial postponement, the attack was on for the morning of May 9, 1915. There was a deafening artillery bombardment intended to soften up the German defenses, but in reality it only warned them of the imminent offensive. Having gotten almost no sleep the night before, the Division Marocain and its contingents of legionnaires went over the top across the fertile red soil of Artois. This was the last major engagement in which the French army went into battle wearing their famed pantalon rouge, with blue overalls over their bright red trousers, and simple cloth kepis. The division poured out on the front line trenches, with their bayonets glittering against the sun and advancing on the boucher without a sign of hesitation. As the Americans' captain shouted for them to advance, the men moved forward into frontline trenches, then out into no man's land in support of their comrades. The first wave was taking enormous casualties as the gunfire from strong German positions was brought to bear on the bodies. The legionnaires ran toward the enemy, then dropped to the ground when the fire became too hot, only to raise themselves and run another 25 meters or so again before dropping to the ground, and then once again renewing the advance. Rockwell described the experience to his brother Paul in a letter. To think of the fear or the horror of the thing was impossible. All I could think of was what a wonderful advance it was, and how everyone was going up against that stream of lead as if he loved it. I kept that up for 5 hours. By then we had advanced 3 or 4 kilometers, but were badly cut up and also mixed up with men from other regiments, mostly Algerians. Most of our officers had fallen, including the colonel, and 3 commandments.